Hello and welcome to the second video on unemployment. Now that we've gone over the definition of unemployment, what the phenomenon is, and the formula for how we measure it, the next thing that we should go over, just like we did with GDP, is the question of whether our way of measuring unemployment is actually accurate, whether it's a good way to measure this phenomenon. Like I said, we have this thing called the unemployment rate. See the previous video. It is measured as the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. But how do we know how many people are unemployed? And how do we draw a distinction between the people who are unemployed, that is to say the people who are able and willing to work in a monetary job, but who do not have a job? How do we draw a distinction between those people and those who are not in the labor force? That is, people who are either not able or not willing to have a job, who are either are not able to work or don't want to. Well, the distinction between these two things, I've circled these two categories here, the distinction between them is quite tricky and there's a lot of gray areas. And because of those gray areas, because it's sometimes difficult to separate these two categories, to separate unemployed from not in the labor force, because of this, there are certain inaccuracies that can occur, that can happen. There are certain reasons why the official unemployment rate might not be an accurate measure of unemployment. And we generally assume that, for reasons that you'll see in a moment, we generally assume that if the official unemployment rate is inaccurate, it's too low. The problem that we could expect to find with the official unemployment rate is that it might be lower than what the real number of unemployed people actually is. So when I say reasons why the unemployment rate might not be accurate, you can also think of that as reasons why the unemployment rate might be lower than what real unemployment actually is. In other words, reasons why there might be people who really should be counted as unemployed, but we're not counting them. What are some of these reasons? Well, first of all, you have to know how we define unemployed, how we define able and willing to work for money but not having a job. Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines a person as unemployed if they don't have a job, they don't have any kind of job, they say that they want a job, and they have been looking for a job in the past 4 weeks. That last part is very important. To count as unemployed, to count as the numerator of that fraction that becomes the unemployment rate, you have to have been looking for a job in the past 4 weeks. You have to have searched for a job in the past 4 weeks. That part of the definition is in there because basically the Bureau of Labor Statistics says, if you've searched for a job in the past 4 weeks, that's how we know that you're serious about wanting a job. If you haven't searched for a job in the past 4 weeks, then we don't think you're really that serious about wanting a job. That's a very arbitrary distinction, right? Why is it 4 weeks? Why is it not 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks or half a year or 1 year or 3 months or whatever? Why isn't it some other amount of time or some other way to measure whether somebody is serious about wanting a job or not? I don't know. That's just how they figured it out. I mean, that's how the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US decided that they're going to measure who is serious and who isn't about looking for a job, about wanting a job. If you've looked in the past 4 weeks, then you're serious. If not, they're going to count you as not actually wanting a job. And by the way, this causes a problem when you're comparing unemployment rates from one country to the other. Like if you're comparing the unemployment rate in the US with that in Canada or somewhere in Europe or Brazil or wherever else. And the problem is the different countries will use different definitions of exactly who counts as unemployed. So the US might use 4 weeks, another country might use a different number of weeks. So therefore, unemployment rates in different countries might not actually be measuring the exact same thing because they have different definitions of who counts as unemployed. But in any case, in the US, it's if you've been looking for a job in the past 4 weeks, then you count as actually wanting a job and therefore being unemployed. The obvious problem here, of course, is that this can leave out a lot of people who really do want a job, but who haven't been looking for one in the past 4 weeks for one reason or another. And we call that category discouraged workers. So these people that we call discouraged workers are one type of hidden unemployment. The textbook mentions that term, and the idea of hidden unemployment refers to possible unemployment that could exist but that isn't captured in the official statistics. Discouraged workers, people who could work, actually do want to work, but they're discouraged. They haven't been able to find a job, so they've given up looking. And because they've given up looking for a job, they haven't been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks, and therefore they don't count as unemployed. We count them as not in the labor force because we confuse them for basically stay-at-home parents, for example, or for stay-at-home people. We have no way to differentiate who's a discouraged worker, statistically speaking, who's a discouraged worker versus who is a person who just stays at home because they want to stay at home. Either way, you look like a person who could work, could have a job, but is not currently looking for a job. Whether you're not looking for a job because you're discouraged and depressed, or whether you're not looking for a job because you're perfectly happy at home the way you are, it's difficult to tell apart those two categories, right? Those are two very different experiences, but it's difficult to tell them apart statistically. Like basically, are you happy or are you unhappy about staying at home and not having a job? It's difficult to measure that. But this can be a serious issue, especially in a very serious economic downturn, like the one that we're experiencing right now, for example. If there's a massive recession or a depression, if things are very bad, then a lot of people might just give up looking for work. And therefore, there might be a lot of these people, there might be a lot of discouraged workers that we're not actually seeing in the official unemployment statistics. So, in other words, when things are bad, like right now, unemployment might actually be a lot worse than it looks because we're not counting the discouraged workers in the official unemployment rate. So we have to keep that in mind. So that's one category of people that we might be counting wrong. There's another category of people that we might be counting wrong in the sense that we're counting them as employed when they should be kind of unemployed. Kind of counted as unemployed. What do I mean by that? Well, remember, in order to count as unemployed, you have to be in a situation where you don't have a job. Any kind of job, not even a part-time job. But what if you do have a part-time job, but you want a full-time one? What if you have, what if you're just working 10 hours a week at McDonald's, but what you really want is a full-time job? Well, then for the purpose of the statistics, you count as employed. If you're working any time at all, you count as employed. You do not count as unemployed. But what if you're, but if you're working a small part-time job, then you might arguably be half unemployed, right? If you're working a small part-time job, but you really want a full-time job, then you have all this time available that you're not using. Sure, it might not be the full 40 hours a week, but it's a big chunk of your time that you would like to use for work, but that you are not using for work because you don't have a full-time job. So if you're working only 10 hours a week when you really want to be working 40 hours, a full-time job, then maybe you should count as 75% unemployed, like 3/4 of an unemployed person, maybe. We don't count it that way. We just count those people as employed and call it a day. But that might be a reason why the unemployment statistics don't quite fully capture the full phenomenon as unemployment. This reason is called underemployment. The idea here, and the reason why we call it underemployment, the idea here is that there are these people that are employed, they have some job, but the job that they have is underusing them. They maybe like I said, it's a part-time job. When they really want to be working a full-time job and they're perfectly capable of working a full-time job, but they cannot find one. So they're underemployed. They have a part-time job when they want a full-time one. An example that is mentioned in the textbook is somebody who is working a job that is far below their skill level. So somebody who has a college degree, but is working a job that you could be doing right out of high school, for instance. That person would also be underemployed. So there are these situations where there are people who are underused. Their skills, their labor power is underused, either because they are part-time when they could be full-time, or because they're working way below their skill level. That ideally, we should count that as part of unemployment somehow. Like I said, maybe we could count someone as half of an unemployed person or 3/4 of an unemployed person, depending on their situation. But basically that would be too much work for the Statistics Bureau to do, so we don't do it and we just count them as employed and call it a day. So that's something to keep in mind. It's another reason why their unemployment rate might not be accurate. And finally, there's a third reason why the unemployment rate might not be accurate, which is not mentioned by name in the textbook, but it's sort of hinted at. And this has to do with, what about people who are just not sure? This can actually be potentially a very large number of people. Look at those people who are not in the labor force. Consider, again, stay-at-home parents. What if you're in a situation where you are a stay-at-home parent, but if a very high-paying job, if the opportunity to get a very high-paying job presented itself, you would apply for that job. You would take it. And then you would change your arrangements. Maybe you'd have somebody else take care of the kids, or you would put them in childcare, or you would do something different from what you're doing right now so that you could take that job because that's a high-paying job. So what if you're in this sort of situation where you don't currently have a job, and you're not looking for a job, you certainly haven't looked for one in the past 4 weeks, but if the right kind of job opportunity should present itself, you would actually take it. You would apply for a job if the right kind of job became available. What about people who are in that situation? And there are a lot of people in that situation. Should they count as unemployed, or should they count as not in the labor force? For the purpose of official statistics, we are counting them as not in the labor force because they're not actively looking for a job. But they would take a job, not any kind of job, but they would take some jobs, right? Right. We call those people marginally attached to the labor force. In other words, they're kind of in between being in the labor force and not being in the labor force. They're marginally attached. They're somewhere in between. They're kind of like dangling from the labor force, as it were, because, again, the labor force is composed of the people who are able to work and want a job. Not in the labor force means you are either not able or you don't want a job. But what if you kind of want a job, but only if it's the right kind of job, depending on what it is and how much it pays? Well, then you're sort of in between, right? You're marginally attached to the labor force. You might want a job, but not any kind of job, only a specific kind of job. There might be a lot of people in this situation. And again, we don't count them as unemployed, we count them as not in the labor force, but maybe we should count them, or at least some of them, as unemployed, at least in some way. And again, the most common situation for this to occur is with people who are stay-at-home parents, or who are caring for their elderly parents, for example, or who are other types of caregivers who may take a job if the right kind of job presents itself. Usually it's a matter of money, Childcare costs a lot of money. So it only makes sense to put the kids in childcare and take a job if the job pays enough to cover the childcare and leave you with a bunch of extra money on top of that. If the job that you're taking pays less than childcare, it makes no sense. You might as well stay at home with the kids. So that's a very typical situation where you might be marginally attached to the labor force. You might not have a job, you might be willing to take one, depending on what it is. Okay, so these are three categories of people: discouraged workers, underemployed people, people marginally attached to the labor force. These are three categories of people who are not counted as unemployed, but who perhaps should be counted as unemployed, or at least they should be counted as, like I said, an underemployed person could perhaps be counted as half of an unemployed person. They should perhaps figure into the unemployment statistics somehow, but they don't. And because they don't, the unemployment rate might be inaccurate, or it might underestimate how many people are experiencing the phenomenon of unemployment, or something very similar to it. It might underestimate how many people are suffering from something that we should call unemployment. And, of course, it might also underestimate how much human labor, how many human resources we're not using. Because, again, we're using them part-time when they could be working full-time, or we've discouraged them and they're no longer looking for work when they would be willing to take a job if they thought that they could actually get one, and so on. So that brings us to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next video, also on the topic of unemployment.